Mhm. All right. I think that's it. And we are live. Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Um, Today, we're going to try out something new, see how you like it, see how I like it, see how Jared likes it. And possibly this will be kind of a reoccurring thing. I'm calling it Philosophy Chat. We're just going to talk about some general historical, philosophical, sociological issues. You're more than welcome to ask me some questions, ask Jared some questions, post them in the chat. We'll respond to them. But today we're going to be talking about Christian nationalism, the rise of Christian nationalism, whether or not, I guess, it's the rise of Christian nationalism. But I have with me here today Jared Farmer. Jared, would you like to give us an introduction?
Greetings. I don't know how much you want me to say about myself.
Just tell us a little
Sort
bit
of.
about your background.
Oh, all right. So, I mean, I grew up in the Pentecostal Holiness Church, which is one of the traditional Pentecostal denominations. Um, Michael and I went to seminary together. I did my undergraduate in analytic philosophy at the University of Illinois. I did 2 masters in theology at Emory University. I did a third master's in philosophy at Claremont Graduate University in Claremont, California, a fourth master's in religion, also at Claremont, and I'm currently at the University of Münster in Münster, Germany, where I'm working on my finishing my PhD. So,
Yeah, Jared, I got to be honest with you. I'm not sure if you're quite qualified enough. I think we might need to
you
toss
know,
in
this
another
isn't
master's.
really. That said, Christian nationalism, so American religion, I have taught, but it's not my area of expertise. Let me just put that out there for any real experts in the topic who may be listening. It's not my area.
Yeah, it's neither. I mean, frankly, it's neither of our areas. If you are a scholar on Christian nationalism and would like to come on the channel, the offer's on the table. Feel free to reach out. But yeah, Jared, you got a strong background in the history of religion, and religion in general, and philosophy. So let's just go ahead and kick it off. Broad, general question: what do you think, how would you define Christian nationalism? Maybe how would you explain Christian nationalism to your uncle at a barbecue? Let's start there.
Well, delicately, I suppose. No. So this is one of those issues, right? So definitions are contentious. So who you ask kind of gives away the game in terms of like how you think about these things. But I think in broad terms, Christian nationalism is distinct from nationalism, which is distinct from, say, patriotism. So let's start there. So patriotism is, let's say, rather innocuous. You can be patriotic in the sense of having warm, cuddly feelings about the place that you're from. There's not anything necessarily wrong with that, right? So cheering for the home team because you're from a particular town, there's nothing wrong with that. Nothing particularly honorable about it, but it just is what it is. People like where they're from. That's okay. Um, Nationalism, though, has some darker connotations in terms of it can lead over into kind of a supremacism that your country is better than other countries inherently for various reasons, and then it becomes a matter of justifying those, right?
Mhm.
That warm feeling turns into a sense of superiority over others, and then how do you justify that sense of superiority? Oh, it's because of our history or because our culture is better. That's when it starts to become rather negative, right? Christian nationalism then is taking that sense and then using kind of the symbols, language, a certain understanding of the history of Christianity in order to justify a sense of superiority over your place, your country. And I should say it's not restricted, of course, to the United States, although it is
Yeah.
or has been prominent in the United States since at least the 1970s. Um, a good example now would be, Putin's Russia, Christian nationalism of an Orthodox character, Orthodox in terms of the Russian Orthodox Church, where Russian Orthodox religious culture has become fused with a sort of nationalism, is another example. And it's not restricted to Christianity either. So you have like examples of Hindu nationalism, for example, in India. You have Jewish nationalism in Israel, Palestine. And so it's a contentious issue. Where do you separate your sense of religion from your sense of identity with respect to place? And how do you parse those things out?
Yeah.
Is that a good place to start, or do you want to tease any of that out?
No, I think that's fantastic. I was thinking about this a little bit before the stream started. Shows where my head's at.
Yeah.
No, but like, yeah. So Christian nationalism. I mean, I think part of the parameters that we want to draw is that most of our conversation is going to focus on specifically its history within the United States, right? Because both of us are obviously American. But that's not to say that it's a uniquely American phenomenon, as you pointed out. I mean, Christian nationalism itself has happened and is happening in other nations. I was telling you about the Irish gentleman I was telling you about earlier. They go by the moniker Math Pig. Shout out Math Pig. Yeah, so we have examples of this in 20th century history where the Christianity of the geographical regions, I mean, I think Ireland's a good example here, right?
Troubles
divided. Which, when I have Math Pig on my channel, I might invite you as well, because he's not that old. He did live through like some of the reverberations, the repercussions of all of that. But you have that.
Well, I mean, it continued on. There were reverberations of it into the 90s. So the worst of it, really, it began without getting too much into it, like the Royal Ulster Constabulary, if I'm probably mispronouncing that. They beat protesters in '68, which was part of the whole movement of 1968. You had riots all over the place. You had incidences in Mexico, in Pakistan. You had, of course, the student uprisings in Paris and in Italy at the University of Turin. You had protests against the Vietnam War in Japan, in England. You had, it was a year of assassinations and all that stuff. So the Troubles began, or at least one of the early flashpoints which led to the Troubles began in '68, when you had members of the Royal Ulster Constabulary, which is like the British forces, beating protesters in Ulster. So all that's kind of connected. Where are we? What are we talking about?
Christian nationalism, that it's not just an American phenomenon, right?
No, but it is. In recent years, it has really ramped up in the U.S. And I think a lot of the discussions, I think a good place to start would be to say that a lot of the discussions about Christian nationalism, which see it as a contemporary phenomenon, haven't gone back and looked at really the roots, which I think the best place to begin was actually with the late 19th century. I mean, to go really far back.
I would go even further back, but I'll let you.
No, I mean, in terms of Christian nationalism, not just like creating the sense of identity and stuff, the collective symbols of civic religion, which become used in Christian nationalism. I think you can certainly go back and say, well, those are present in early American life. And you can even say things like, oh, well, some of the really negative aspects in terms of its connections to imperialism or whatnot, Christianity's complicity in imperialism, that those are all present and those are all justified. But I mean, in terms of the immediate history,
Yeah.
it doesn't begin with Donald Trump. It doesn't begin with the moral majority in the 1970s. It doesn't begin with Scopes monkey trial. I think that the best place to begin is to go back and look at the late 19th century. And I think that it's really connected with a sense of patriarchy.
Mm.
Um, Now, if you've read the book Jesus and John Wayne, um, the, it's an excellent book. And the author, whose name is, you know, slipping from my mind at the present, um, she makes the case essentially that uh, the the patriarchal elements in evangelical Christianity stem, at least in part, of course, you know, when you talk about big social shifts and social factors, there's a lot of moving pieces, and so to say that it's this one thing is always a bit misleading. But I think that one element that isn't spoken about enough is the fact that, you know, throughout most of the 19th century, most men were employed either in factory jobs or in agriculture.
Mm-hmm.
And you don't really see a lot of discussions of masculinity during that period. And the reason why is because kind of traditional gender roles are taken for granted. But by the end of the 19th century, going into the 20th century, you're starting to see a cultural shift where you have a lot more people who are punching a clock, going to office jobs or doing service jobs, right? You have less people who are working in agriculture, less people who are working in factory employment. And there starts to be this sense of a crisis of masculinity, which is then addressed by appeals to muscular Christianity, right? So, in areas where you have people beginning to question or to feel an inadequate sense of their own masculinity, is where you start to see kind of these appeals to masculinity, these attempts to bolster masculinity, encouraging things like, oh, weightlifting is a thing now. And, you know, all of these things, like, and you see it today too, right? All toxic pickup culture and all these things that have been proliferating on social media recently are definitely connected to a sense of a crisis in masculinity. But Christianity itself was not immune from this, right? So you have to remember that at the time, Christianity is very much still the lingua franca of American culture, even if you don't have people who are actively religious in terms of participating in religious life, they still speak a language of cultural Christianity. And there's also this concern that Christianity is in some sense not masculine enough, right?
Mm-hmm.
That you have Jesus isn't out there busting heads, and you know, and so there's a sense of inadequacy about that, and so you start to see kind of a more machismo pushed into the language and culture of Christianity in order to kind of bolster it from charges that it's weak, that it's you know, is inadequate in that respect. And this is also where you start to see the sense that if there is cultural decline, right, this prevailing sense of cultural decline, which is in part, you know, xenophobic feelings about an influx of immigrants from coming in from elsewhere, leading to cultural decline, that there's a feminization of culture, that there's this fear among many American men in particular that we have lost some sense of our own power, that there's some sense of inadequacy about us, and that, you know, is connected to this fear of the other coming in, right? And so these things, which do not immediately seem connected, actually have a lot of overlap, a lot of parallels.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought that up because I was watching some YouTube videos while I was cleaning today to kind of get the brain juices flowing for this conversation. And what kind of stood out to me in a lot of the conversations and lectures that I was listening to about Christian nationalism is that Christian nationalism seems to like uphold ideas and values that are sometimes inherently at odds with what a lot of people would think of as like traditional Christianity. And I think the whole idea of like this masculine image that you were talking about is a fantastic example of that, because you know there's not a whole lot in the New Testament that corresponds with what we see being like kind of put forward as like the Christian man, right? Like the hyper masculine, the big beard, the shaved head, and lifting weights, and the alpha male type figure that's put forward by a lot of these like not new age pastors, but contemporary pastors that are talking about masculinity. Um, and I was thinking about that because there's a lot of these aspects of Christian nationalism like that stand out to me. To kind of shift the conversation a little bit, and I'm more than happy to talk about the 21st century Christian man, but you see that with another aspect of Christian nationalism, which is kind of the racial component to it. Usually, especially specifically within United States history, when we're talking about Christian nationalism, where a vast majority of that is white Christian nationalism.
White Christian nationalism, yeah. So today, white evangelicalism and white Christian nationalism have very strong overlaps, and there are non-white evangelicals, especially in the Hispanic community, but there's also non-white evangelicals in terms of there are black churches, members of the black church, which adhere to the traditional doctrinal beliefs, which we would in a academic setting ascribe to evangelicalism, to the history of evangelicalism, but which either do not self-identify as evangelical, or if they do, they tend to distance themselves politically and ideologically from white evangelicals. And part of that has to do with this considerable overlap with white Christian nationalism. Because if you think about it in terms of who is this appealing to, right? If we say that it's a sense of embattlement, a sense of loss of identity of place, then who is it appealing to? It's appealing to white Protestant men for the most part. Who are they being threatened by, right? They're being threatened that they feel that they're inadequate in terms of the sort of work that they do. And so they have to find outlets for masculinity in other domains, right? You can find that in other traditionally male pursuits, things like hunting and fishing and weightlifting and things like that. Of course, these are not exclusive to men, but these are things which are coded as masculine.
Right.
And these are things which attract a lot of men, not just because it's a pastime that appeals to them, but it appeals to them specifically because it allows them to express masculinity or to perform masculinity in a way that they cannot do in their everyday life because of the sort of work that they do, or what have you. And the threats are threats of femininity, right? Of the charge of femininity. Going back to where I said with, the other thing about the late 1890s going into the early 20th century is you have a lot more educated women, right? You have the beginnings of the suffragette movements, of movements for women's rights, of birth control, of feminism, first wave of feminism. And so all of this is seen as threatening, right? You have people coming from the outside who are going to take our jobs, that our jobs are not what they used to be, that women are now coming into the workforce, and there's this sense of emasculation. Now, again, this is all silly, right? But not to a lot of people. It's a feeling that they have.
Yeah.
And while the causes we may say are you shouldn't you shouldn't be threatened by a woman coming into the workplace or getting an education, but it doesn't mean that a lot of people aren't, right?
Yeah.
And so there's this sense that we have to reestablish our masculinity. And again, this is all connected with a sense of cultural decline. So you have Catholic immigrants coming in from Italy, from Poland, things like that, Jews coming in from Europe, and it's undermining this sense of nativism and this sense of shared Protestant culture.
Right.
And so you can't disconnect that from the religious sentiments, because the religious aspect of this is connected to our identity as Protestants, which again comes back to what we said before with this shared sense of the mythology of the United States, which took shape in the post-Civil War era, that the United States was founded by devout Christians, right, to create a haven for Protestant Christianity, which of course we know from actual American history that was not the case, right? But it's part of the shared mythology, which was infused into the culture. It became part of the cultural identity of the period, such that any digression away from that felt like an embattled sense of threat, a threat which had to be met. And you could say the same things about whiteness, right? Like that whiteness was taken for granted as dominant, but there's this constant sense of embattlement of this that someone's going to take your place, right? Yeah. And so a lot of the vitriol, a lot of the braggadociousness, all right, of this particular subculture comes from this constant state of persecution complex, which then gets tied into the actual history of Christianity. So Christianity, prior to its being legalized in the Roman Empire, was actively persecuted in different ways in different spaces, right? So what it meant to be persecuted in Rome, for example, versus what it meant to be persecuted in a backwater somewhere, it's different, right? It wasn't really enforced in the same ways, and there are different levels of persecution. All that caveats. Yeah. The point is that there was actual religious persecution in the early days of the church, and so when you have a culture which is immersed in the language of Christianity, anytime there is a feeling of embattlement, whether it's real or imagined, there's going to be this appeal to this early sense of persecution, that what it means to be a Christian is to be persecuted. Therefore, if I feel as though I'm being threatened, then I must be being persecuted. And I can interpret that through a Christian lens, which is, I am the righteous, this is the world, and the world is here to persecute me because I am righteous.
Yeah, that makes sense. To kind of build off that a little bit, and by the way, if y'all have any questions for Jared or myself, but mostly for Jared, feel free to post them in the chat. No, that makes a lot of sense. Kind of what I was thinking about, and I'd like to get your feedback on this. While I was listening to some videos about this and the article that I read about this, most people act like I'm familiar with the body of literature as a whole. I'm not. But a lot of what I was hearing tended to trace the rise of Christian nationalism back, especially to like the 80s, like the moral majority movement, the kind of
Mhm.
merging of American Christianity with the political right in this country. Um, I would, what comes to my mind though, especially if we're talking about white Christian nationalism in the United States, I don't think you can divorce a lot of what's happening now politically, to sound like a like stereotypical history teacher, right, with what happened in our past. Especially what comes to my mind, of course, is the transatlantic slave trade, the
Mhm.
status of slaves in the United States for most of U.S. history, and then also what happened with Native Americans and Manifest Destiny, because I see a lot of what we're talking about kind of take shape. Like if you look at the 1800s, in the kind of final stages of the war that's happening on Native Americans, the kind of the push westward, especially, there's this ethos that it's kind of a taking back and a reclaiming of the land
Mhm.
in the name of like white Christianity, right?
Yeah.
Or with respect to slavery, especially in the American South, if you look at like sermons that white Southern pastors were preaching prior to the Civil War, a lot of it is this sense of duty and purpose that white Southerners had to. Now this is all like politicized, obviously, to serve the purpose of the of the ruling elite of the
Yeah.
South, which was to keep the slave population in check. And part of that was this religious these religious ideas of racial superiority of the white Christian over and against African Americans, even though the idea was to convert them. The idea was that as white Christians, especially, that there was some sort of like moral high ground or intellectual high ground that was
Yeah.
had.
Well, I mean, if you go back and you read like Kipling's "White Man's Burden," right? The poem. I guess you'd consider it a poem. It was a. It was originally a magazine article, whatnot. But where we get that phrase from, "the white man's burden," is from this writing by Kipling, where he refers to natives as half devil, half child, and the responsibility that he puts on white people is that, even if you don't want to, right, it's you have to take up the white man's burden. The white man's burden is to civilize the world, right? Because it's your god-given responsibility to go and help these people, right, who cannot or will not help themselves because they're half devil, half child, to lead them, down the glorious path of civilization. And if we just, take some of their resources on the side, then it's a fair trade, right? The thing is, you can't. The reason why it's so difficult to talk about a term like white nationalism in the context of the history of the United States is it requires so much background, right? You can't divorce it from, as you said, something like Manifest Destiny. You can't divorce it from the wars of religion in Europe. You can't divorce it from, the transatlantic slave trade. You can't divorce it just from the history of race relations in the country. You can't divorce it. So, like whiteness, which is a term that has to be, like broken down and explained in its, manifold ways, its history. You have to disentangle that. You have to talk about how these things intersect with nationalism, how the politicization of religion and the uh, religionization of politics go hand in hand, right? That you can't talk about these things separately, but you have to disentangle them and then talk about how they overlap with each other.
Mm.
And to understand kind of this diffused picture, you have to have kind of at your command um, a large a large amount of information with respect to the history of the country. And frankly, most people aren't that interested and don't have the resources at their disposal.
Mm. Yeah. So let's move it forward a bit, because to go back to one of the things that you were saying before when you were talking about like the relationship between Christian nationalism and masculinity, um, one of the things that I said was that it's one of the things that intellectually makes me interested in this is that Christian nationalism seems to be at odds with some of the things that like traditional Christianity is promoting. And in contemporary politics, I think this has taken the form of things that Christianity doesn't really have, has not had, I should say, in the past, has not had a whole lot to say about. Kind of what immediately comes to mind are things like immigration, right?
Mm-hmm.
White nationalism, or even just Christian nationalism nowadays, is very concerned with immigration. Specifically, of course, the code word there, right? When we're talking about immigration, we're really talking about immigration from the Mexican border, right?
Mm-hmm.
So let's talk
Or
about
from the Mexican border, but basically brown people in general.
yeah, right. Brown
No,
people in general,
no one's worried about policing the Canadian border,
right?
or Europeans overstaying their visas, right? All of the concern is about Venezuelans and Mexicans, Costa Ricans coming up through the Mexican border. That there's an invasion on the southern border, right? But
Right.
not at the north.
And then, probably more recently, the kind of controversial stuff that happened during Trump's presidency of banning people from Muslim countries.
Muslim
Right.
countries. Yeah, I think that again, all of these things are of a piece, right? You can't really separate them because it's a it's a package deal, Christian nationalism. And to the extent, I mean, you can definitely disentangle it from traditional Christianity and say, it's a losing game to talk about true Christianity versus false Christianity,
Right.
because, it's all a game of interpretation. You could say the same thing about just about anything. Real Americans versus false Americans. It becomes, the no Scotsman fallacy, right? So I think a better way to talk about it is not real versus fake, but to say that, as you said, there's not really a precedent for prioritizing something like immigration, and particularly a racist immigration policy, and then calling it Christian, right? There certainly is in the United States. We did that in the 20th century as well. But outside of that, it's difficult to square that with the actual words of Christian scripture, right? Because as any liberal Christian will point out to you, Jesus was an immigrant, right? Jesus was a refugee. Jesus fled, right? The Bible is very concerned with, and the actual letter of the Bible is concerned with the immigrant, the stranger, right? The widow, the poor, and how you can take, scripture, Christian scripture, and make it about capitalism, and a manual for CEOs, that you can use it to justify, right? Jesus the CEO, or any some such thing is very difficult to square unless you understand that these are not things which are based primarily on the Christian religion as such, or scripture as such, or the history of Christianity as such. These are things which are based on cultural Christianity, right? That's something that we can distinguish, right? There is a Protestant culture in the United States, which is easily divorceable from religion as practiced, the history of religion as practiced. And you can be deeply immersed in the tropes, the sort of civic language of Christianity, and never set foot in the church, to not have any understanding of Christian doctrine. I would say the average person that even attends Christian service couldn't tell you the first thing about orthodox doctrine, rightly or wrongly. I mean, it's not something that enters most people's mind.
Yeah.
Having been raised in an evangelical subculture, I can tell you that the majority of observant Christians, they might read the Bible, right? But they read it as a manual for life. And if they read any sort of commentary on the Bible, they read like daily devotionals,
Yeah.
right? Which are written by evangelicals, right? If they go to try to understand the Bible better, who are they going to turn to? They're going to turn to their local pastor, most of whom in the evangelical community had never attended seminary, have no formal training. They're going to go to a Lifeway Christian bookstore, right, which is stocked with books by celebrity pastors, by evangelical celebrities, people that make duck calls for a living. Those are the sort of books that will be there, right?
Yeah.
And then all of this is seen as a piece, right? So it's really hard to get outside of the scope of this because it's all self-reinforcing, right? So you turn on the Christian TV channels, right, and you have pastors there espousing Christian nationalism, or at least an evangelical fundamentalist understanding of Scripture.
Yeah.
So that's on the TV. You turn to your Christian radio station. These are all things that we have in the United States. If you're listening from outside of the United States, some of this may seem strange to you, but these are things that we have in the United States. Your local Christian radio station, that radio station is going to be, in between, songs which are, vapid or outright speaking, fundamentalist talking points. You'll have commentary from people like, James Dobson, right?
Mm-hmm.
Telling people how to raise their kids according to fundamentalist doctrine. So entertainment, you have evangelical music and social commentary, you have evangelical preaching, and frankly, your local pastor who didn't go to seminary is probably getting all of their talking points from those same books and those same celebrity pastors. It's all rolled into a ball.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you are within that community and you're not just an inherently curious person who wants to go outside of it to say, okay, well, what do other people think? Then it's going to be very easy for you to be stuck within that circle. Hello, Raymond.
Hello.
So we do have a question, but before we get to the question, I would like to introduce everyone to Raymond. This is a bit of a reunion for us. We used to have a podcast called the Front Porch Philosophers. This is how I know Jared. Well, I know them prior to that, but anyway, Raymond, you want to give a brief introduction to yourself?
Yeah, sure. My name's Raymond. Nice. Is that good? Is that all I need? Just my name?
No. You kind of cut out there. Yeah.
Oh, okay. You know what? I should be good, but yeah. So have a PhD in religion. Philosophy of religion is my specialty. Most of what I do is primarily German thought. Immanuel Kant, early modern to modern. Not really dabbled much in postmodern, so forgive me if I don't keep up with Christian nationalist movements, apart from the occasional drop of Marjorie Taylor Greene and the nonsense that spews out of her mouth. So,
Oof.
yeah.
Well, that's why I'm having a new program. It's called Invite Academics On to ask them questions about stuff that they're not an expert in the field in. So welcome, welcome, Raymond.
Yeah.
So we have a question from Aaron. Aaron asks, "What denomination or movement is currently at the forefront of Christian nationalism, and why? Why do you think that? What makes you say that?" Raymond, how about you start us off?
I'd be hard pressed to say that there was any specific. If we were talking about movements and not not a denomination. I don't know if I could say that it's pegged into one denomination. There's been so much fracturing in denominations as of late, especially the big ones that you would normally associate with this. My assumption is that you would have to loosely organize these people into a certain set of values and ideals that may not be specific to like an actual institution that is organized in a fashion. Institutions tend to move very slowly for change. So despite whether members may have one way or the other, I don't think you would see a lot of traction in the institutions themselves. So I would say there's probably a looser alliance, or at least an ideological movement, which I think is an accurate way of framing this, Aaron, is definitely a movement as opposed to a denomination per se. There could be some sort of interdenominational, like groups and organizational things that are happening where they have like an association meeting or a gathering of some kind, but I don't think it's really rooted in any particular denomination per se. If I was going to say that there was one that was sort of like, I don't know, I'll say this with great caution because my wife is Catholic. If if I could point at one organization that's kind of that's been lying in wait and that kind of maneuvers very sophisticatedly in the background under a movement, it would be Catholicism. Um, very specific conservative elements within that I think have a very much better understanding of using institutions to get things done and organized than most of the Protestant groups, who are sort of inherently anti-elitist and anti-institutionalist in their own right. So, but it's this weird overlap of the like Marjorie Taylor Greenes on one side and the, Amy Coney Barrett's on the other. So I'll leave it at that to start. You guys keep talking. I'm gonna plug a hard line into my laptop so I don't lag or anything. It'll take me like 5 seconds, but I'm listening.
Go ahead, Jared.
Just to piggyback off of that, I would agree with Raymond insofar as saying that denominations are not really the driver of American Christianity anymore. They are hardly even a factor. First, mainline denominations still have some degree of control over they're more institutional in structure. So like the United Methodist Church, the Presbyterian Church, these are considered mainline denominations. But they've been bleeding, membership for decades. They're not nearly as influential as they once were. What you have seen in the United States and also in Africa and in Latin America, you're starting to see much more growth of evangelicalism and in particular Pentecostalism. And a lot of that has to do with these parachurch organizations becoming much more powerful than traditional denominations. When you have this large amorphous evangelical culture that I was referring to a moment ago, right? Then it's not there's no one in the driving seat, right? For the most part, you have people who are piggybacking off of each other. You have all of these different organizations, charities, marketing companies, entertainment conglomerates, which are all working not necessarily in concert, but who are working off of each other's energy, right? So they're being as much driven by market influences as they are anything else. And I think that one of the things when Donald Trump first announced that he was running for president, you could see it in terms of the early reactions to Donald Trump running. Now, of course, there were elements of evangelicalism, certain leaders who were enthusiastic supporters from the beginning, but many evangelicals were initially backing people like Ted Cruz, right? Which, you could argue is not that different, but it's certainly different in presentation. And it certainly was, the difference in presentation was certainly greater in 2015 and 2016. Donald Trump was seen as vulgar, all of the things. Everyone knows all the details about Donald Trump's life, right? There's no need to rehash them. And so a lot of the, these pastors or whatnot were kind of shocked by their support amongst the rank and file in their denominations, and they got pushed back, and then many of them have subsequently followed their own flock, as it were, right? Because they, which way the wind's blowing, which side of the bread you're, butter the toast on, whatever the expression is. Point is, had like a George W. Bush moment there, right? I lost the metaphor halfway through. Anyway, the point is that if you think about it in terms of this subculture that members of different denominations participate in, at a certain point, and it's hard to discern where this happened, at a certain point, traditional gatekeepers lost control, right? And now it's being driven by all of these other factors which are impacting each other. And I think it's best to think of it in terms of market forces as opposed to, leadership from particular denominations. All of that said, I think that there are certain groups, right? It used to be the case. So, for example, in the 70s and 80s and into the 90s, the Southern Baptist Convention was heavily involved in the moral majority. But now the Southern Baptist Convention has itself fractured in various ways. So it's much less a factor these days.
It definitely feels like if you were going to kind of align this or parallel this to Christian movements and just sort of Christian development in the last couple of decades, the current political spectrum on the right side feels very much like the sort of large flux of churches who divided and broke and splintered into non-denominational. It's very much it's leaderless. There's like loose alliances. You get occasional people who pop up that are popular, but none of them really have any ability to organize, or I would say like really put rubber to road, or at least do it in a way where everybody backs one person. I don't know. It's just very strange. It's kind of a cutthroat. Like everybody wants to have their limelight, and everybody wants to do it exactly the way they want to do it, and nobody wants to compromise. So get a movement that can actually, take off or do anything. You're just going to have a bunch of like street corner politicians, and they're all probably preaching similar things, but none of them are going to like go to the same, church on Sunday type thing.
So Aaron, rephrase the question, and I've heard of none of these groups, so forgive my pronunciation of some of them, but Catholic, Integralists, Christian Reconstructionist / Reformed, Seven Mountain Mandate. I don't know what that is. Which group do you think is the greatest driver of these national ideologies?
Again, I would say that these are, distinct ideological forms which are not constrained by denomination. Now, I think the Catholic integralism is an interesting one. I think Catholicism, as Raymond mentioned, is kind of this interesting dark horse in terms of this, which doesn't get a lot of attention. Yeah. And I think that its origins are outside of the United States. So without getting into too much detail, for those who aren't familiar with contemporary Catholicism, so Catholicism took a hard stance against modernity for about a century, right? And this had a lot to do with the Napoleonic Wars and whatnot, and had to do with Italian nationalism. There was a lot of factors, right? So conflicts between, the Holy Roman Empire, the French republics, the early stages of Italian nationalism. So the papacy was heavily involved in the politics of the time, trying to protect their sovereignty over the papal states, which were this large swath of land in central Italy that the papacy had controlled essentially since the 8th century, right? So there were lots of political reasons why the Pope was deeply opposed to modernity, and a lot of them had to do with real politics, not just, um, like a reactionary sense of, oh, the times are changing. The issue was the times are changing and they're coming for our land, right? So the imperial church really came to an end with like Pope Pius X. And then from like, let's see, Pope Leo Pope Leo the 12th, I think, was the first pope who kind of shifted gears and said, okay, well, we're going to be less concerned about retaking our land or reasserting ourselves over the papal states. This is all, lost time. What we need to instead do is to create a culture war, basically, right? We're going to reassert a strong sense of foundationalism, and we're going to make ourselves what's the word I'm looking for? We're going to make ourselves central to this. It's not the word I'm looking for, but it's the same thing. We're going to be central in this return to order, this return to, these revolutions they've destabilized Europe. This led to all of this stuff. What people want now is a return to order, and we're going to be important to that. In a weird academic sense that we don't have to get into right now, this is also connected to when the papacy started to prop up Thomism, right, in the academy, for various reasons that we don't have to get into, but that's just an aside. All of that to say, this went on until the 1950s, right? So for roughly a century, the Catholic Church had this really staunch anti-modernist political philosophical stance. And all of this changed essentially overnight with the death of I think it was Pius XII, and the ascendancy of John the 23rd. So when Pope John the 23rd came to power, he was essentially chosen because he was affable and he was old. No one thought that he would kick up much fuss, that he would be a transitional pope, that he was pretty friendly, didn't have too many enemies in the curia, and so his papacy would be uneventful. But lo and behold, he called for an ecumenical council, Vatican II. And Vatican II fundamentally changed contemporary Catholicism for reasons in ways that we don't have time to get into. It's too far off topic, too tangential. But the point is, this broke the culture of the Catholic Church, because you had huge changes to the Catholic Church in the matter of a couple of years, right? So the main drivers of this were John the 23rd and then his successor, Paul VI. But then the subsequent papacies, Pope John Paul I was only Pope for a month, so he's kind of a non-factor. But John Paul II and Benedict represented not a break with Vatican II, but kind of a conservative pulling back, right? The Catholic Church had made this huge shift towards reform, to updating the Catholic Church. And it created tensions overnight. There were numerous breakaway groups, and all of these groups were hostile to the changes that came with Vatican II. So John Paul II and Benedict represented kind of a conservative pulling back of this. And the Catholic Church has dealt with this internal conflict ever since. Now, integralism was a movement going back to what I said before with this first culture war, where they decided, okay, well, there's not going to be an imperial papacy anymore. Integralism was the attempt to essentially put culture, especially culture in predominantly Catholic countries like Italy, back under the thumb of the Catholic Church. And so you have had these reactionary forces, these conservative forces, in tension with these progressive forces in the Catholic Church for roughly a century, century and a half. Now, you have in recent years started to kind of see this bubbling up of these groups. Some of them have completely broken with Rome. They consider every pope since John the 23rd to be a heretic, and they want some of them even have their own modern anti-popes, and this is the group, right, that you find your Steve Bannons in, right? These people that think that the Catholic Church should be running culture, but it should be a restored Catholic Church, a reactionary Catholic Church. And so you have, in varying degrees, Catholics across the world, but in the United States as well, your Amy Coney Barrett's, and again, your Steve Bannons or whatnot, who are operating within this church militant conception of Catholicism, which is hostile to updates in the Catholic Church. And this is intellectually similar to dominionism, which is essentially similar to, this is bring us full circle in terms of Christian nationalism. Dominionism is this idea that Christianity, there is no separation of church and state, and that Christianity should be over the state. That the United States was founded on Christianity, so the story goes, and that it should continue to be judged by Christian standards. And by Christian standards, they of course mean, fundamentalist evangelical Christian standards. And so these are of a piece, even though they're separated, they have separate origins and they're related to each other. They're separated in terms of distinct Christian cultures, but they overlap in terms of ideological presuppositions. And that's why you are starting to see some very interesting and odd connections, right, between like a reactionary Catholic and Steve Bannon versus a evangelical fundamentalist like Marjorie Taylor Greene. They're going to have some overlaps in their conceptions of Christianity's relationship to, and even now Russian Orthodoxy, right? So Russian Orthodoxy is quite distinct in terms of its own cultural approach, but because of realignments in geopolitics, you now see a lot of evangelicals finding common purpose with Russian Orthodox, right? So all of this is a game of pragmatic political realignments, right? They all espouse a certain sort of Christian nationalism, and in that they see common cause with each other. But if they had any sense of kind of theological nuance, they would see that there's less there than they think in terms of overlap. But of course, this has very, very little. That's the strange and interesting thing about Christian nationalism, is just how little Christianity seems to do with it.
Yeah.
And by Christianity, I mean like the historical doctrinal beliefs of the largest faith in world history. The fact that these figures seem to know next to nothing about the actual doctrines, beliefs of Scripture, yet feel comfortable identifying themselves primarily as Christians, is interesting on a number of levels.
Want to add to that, Ray?
That really answered the question.
No, I think it did. Jared's our resident professor, so you'll get the full picture when he talks. And I just come in and add colorful commentary, and Michael tends to do the same, mostly commentary about us. Yes. So the first two, the integralist for sure, that's playing a part. The Reformed tradition's a weird one, I would say. I think that there is a sense in which they're trying to, but they're kind of in a point of self contradiction, because so much of the Reformed tradition wants to keep, let Caesar have Caesar, so to speak, right? So they're very much kind of like not. I wouldn't say that they're trying to push separation of church and state. I would just say that um, they kind of just want to put their heads down and go about doing God's work in the way that they see fit. That doesn't necessarily have to deal with like being political. Most of the Reform people I grew up around in Mississippi, uh, once we got to of age of voting and things like that, and being fully active political participants, a lot of them really struggled with the whole thing and just kind of left it up to an inconvenience. So I don't even know if a lot of those people are even voting people today. So Marjorie Taylor Greene, as Jared, he didn't speak to her explicitly, but just the idea that they don't really know that what they're promoting isn't really in keeping with the values that they may have come out of. Like I would expect she came out of some version or some tangential Protestant group that was probably more reformed than not, and is just probably just completely departed from it. I don't know the Pentecostal movement. It's Seven Mountain Mandate. I'm pretty sure it's Pentecostal. I don't know anything about Pentecostal movements. That's Jared's book usually, so I'll let him speak to that.
Well, with the Reformed tradition, I mean, are we speaking about the Reformed tradition? I could have confused the question. If we're talking about the Reformed tradition, then I think that some of that's going to relate to, say, your John Pipers and Mark Driscoll's.
Yeah,
right?
it was
Which
both.
is like
It was
the Mars Hill, the Mars Hill groups and whatnot. And I think that gets back to what I've seen a lot of that is the emphasis of the John Pipers and the Mark Driscolls seems to be this hyper patriarchy, right? Um, the elements that I was referring to, Ray, before you got here, referred to like muscular Christianity in the early 20th century. And what I see a lot of the really toxic patriarchal elements in evangelicalism, I feel have come from the John Pipers and Mark Driscolls. I must say, having grown up in the Pentecostal denomination, I can't speak for the denomination as a whole. I'm personally no longer affiliated with it. But the sort of language that Mark Driscoll or John Piper have used, that I've heard them use with respect to women, is so disrespectful that it wouldn't have ever passed muster amongst the people that I was around. It's very, very sexist language, which I'm not saying that Pentecostalism has been a haven for what's the term I'm looking for, enlightened masculinity or anything, but the out and out sexism of Mark Driscoll has been really shocking to me.
So I have two questions here that were posted in the chat. I'm not going to attempt to pronounce that. Nanalu? I'm sorry if I said that wrong. The other one's from Darren, who's a friend of mine that I went to undergraduate with, who's also a philosophy teacher. I'm going to get him on. He's already been on the channel, but I'm going to get him to participate in one of these philosophy chats soon. Shout out to Darren. But with respect to Christian nationalism, so the first question is, Nanalu says that I grew up thinking there was a Christian origin to the United States. So maybe we can talk about kind of the mythological foundations of Christian nationalism, kind of how they spin history, how history is gleaned to fit their narrative. And then the second part to that, kind of how U.S. politics or the U.S. Constitution is gleaned to fit their narrative. Darren asked, I wonder how they square that with the constitutional free exercise of religion, i.e. the right to be non-Christian. So how do Christian nationalists, first part of that, how do they interpret history the way they want to? And the second part of that, how do they interpret the Constitution? They want to.
Well, I think that first they're quick to point out that separation of church and state doesn't appear in the Constitution. That's a letter to the Danbury Baptists, which, as far as they're concerned, expresses Thomas Jefferson's personal feelings, but doesn't have any kind of official status and shouldn't be used to interpret the Constitution. With respect to the free exercise of religion, I think that the justification is, well, yes, of course, people should they should be free to worship whatever they want to. This is America, right? But they also, believe the contradictory belief that America was founded as a Christian country and that Christianity should have priority, right? That our laws, we're still a Christian majority country, at least, in terms of statistics. Therefore, the assumption is that Christianity, because of our history, especially our imagined history, and the statistical representation of Christians in the country, means that Christianity, not Hinduism or Buddhism or atheism, should be given priority in terms of how we run the country. That Christians should be running the country. As far as its origins, I mean, it's just a matter of fact that while many of the framers of the country were practicing Christians, many of them were not, right? There were free thinkers among them which were considered atheists in the 18th century. They would better be described these days as free theists or deists, for the most part, with respect to someone like Franklin or Jefferson. But you take Jefferson, for example. Jefferson was frankly hostile to Christianity in many respects. I mean, there's the example of the Jefferson Bible, right? So he didn't believe in the divinity of Jesus, and he literally cut out all the supernatural elements in the Bible. He had his own version of the Bible, which was just moral maxims from Jesus. And it wasn't just Jefferson, right? So if you look at Unitarian like John Adams, when John Adams was president, I think this is the most definitive statement from the founders about their intentions. If you look at the treaty with Tripoli, I don't remember the year that was given, but the treaty with Tripoli, John Adams, which was Muslim majority country, John Adams specifically says in the treaty that the United States was not in any sense based upon the Christian religion. That's about as definitive as you can get, right? And then, of course, the First Amendment. So you do have in the 18th century a lot of interest, and you see this in the Virginia statutes, right, that Jefferson helped write. You see it in Madison's comments on religion, that they had a real concern about religious persecution, and that they also had a concern that, if not an openness to all religions, especially the traditional Abrahamic religions, that Christianity, Judaism, all of the various species of Christianity, which were represented in the 18th century at the time in the United States, Judaism and Islam should be respected, right? That they shouldn't be persecuted. They still had, many of them still had hostile feelings towards atheism, which they thought undermined civic religion, which they thought was central to, patriotic life. But, the circumstances were quite different. Certainly, the majority of them were not evangelical Christians in the way that we think of them today, or certainly the way that they're presented by, the likes of Christian nationalists. Other thoughts?
And
What do you make
I'll
of
add,
those, Ray?
to sort of how the origins truly came about. there's always been a tension between secularism and Christianity, or really just religion in general, in the Americas from the European side of things, not from the indigenous people side of things. But from the European perspective, you got to remember coming over here during the colonization of the Americas. It wasn't a pleasant thing to do. A lot of the people that were sent here were being basically, kicked out of Europe because they were tired of their religious perspectives, or they were poor and they thought maybe they could, make something here that would get them out from under the boot of, nobility and the injustices in Europe at the time. So Anabaptist, Moravians, Puritans, a lot of those people were sent over because Europeans, the powers that be and the religions that were kind of in control of each of the nation states at the time, just they were tired of them. They didn't want them, so they just kind of sent them.
I think though that we should say that part of the reason why is you think of someone like the Pilgrims, right? Who are as integral to American mythology as anything. The Pilgrims, for the most part, I mean, I could be wrong on this. I mean, if memory is not serving me correctly, please correct me if I'm wrong. But as I recall, the Pilgrims were mostly Brownists, which were like an offshoot of Calvinism, and they were essentially dominionists. It was less that they were experiencing persecution in England than it was that they wanted to dominate religious life, and people found them intolerable. And so, in order to flee persecution, which meant to flee their desire to, persecute others, or more specifically to have a community where they could do whatever they wanted to, that they could have their own kind of closed off society, which is a recurring theme in a lot of places in the United States. Mm-hmm. Christians trying to create intentional communities, almost like Calvin's Geneva, right, which are closed off and frankly many times pretty repressive communities, which don't have to worry about outsiders mucking about and telling them what to do.
Right. Yeah. So a couple of things I wanted to add there and then move on to the next topic. It's curious to me. Well, it's always curious to me to see how people utilize history to kind of like weaponize what they're trying to say or their current belief system. But the origins of the United States, I mean, granted, the origins of every country always take on this kind of mythical, like quasi-religious status in that nation's history. And so, but what I've seen with Christian nationalism, what's concerning about it, I was at someone's house, this was a few years ago, and the person's parents had bought their child these Rush Limbaugh children's books. I don't know if you've seen them before, but it's these kids' books about like early American history. And this is one of the things that gets perpetuated a lot. I've seen in kids' books and on Facebook memes and kind of the repositories for Christian nationalism, it seems like.
Yeah.
Is this idea that, and this is how they justify the second part of that, right? The second part of the question that Darren asked, how do they exercise it? How do they reconcile it, square it with the constitutional free exercise of religion? How I've seen it done, and again, small sample size, so take it with what I say with a grain of salt, but how I've seen it done is the argument goes something like, well, America was founded as a Christian nation by Christians. And like, yes, we want to be respectful towards people. Yes, we don't want to like actively persecute people. But the idea is that the U.S. government and that America as an institution, as a governing body, is founded by and directed by Christian principles. I guess how would y'all, however you want to unpack that, how would you respond to it historically, politically, whatever? Ray, you want to start us off?
I would think that if we were to say anything, positive about the forefathers, which can be hard sometimes to find, um, it would be to say that they were more interested in free thinking, people who were striving to create self-determination within their life, and all of the Christian nationalism, it all roots on this very simple principle of trying to get back to a time, that's long past. And I would argue that all of the forefathers, at least most of them, would probably hate them, because that was definitely not the point. I mean, how they rewrote the Constitution like 10 years after they wrote the first one. We've added countless amendments. I mean, we've just, as a society, we've just sort of like lost the ability to reinvent and create ourselves anew as Americans. And I think that that's one of our big struggles. And that's why all of these people are pushing back so hard, is because we've had massive wins in civil rights, which was followed up by massive wins in the LGBTQ. I mean, it goes on and on. Abortion, it's and it's backlash. They're trying to recover, times in the past, instead of trying to create things for ourselves here, beholden to a bunch of dead white guys. And I don't think that they would want that, and I don't think that we should want that. So yeah, that I think it's just mythologizing, trying to justify the way that they want to live, that they can't reconcile with the way things are, by looking at the way things used to be, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
I
Jerry.
think it's interesting how it parallels. It's interesting how that structure parallels with whiteness. What I mean by that is, whiteness essentially says, well, we don't hate other people, right? We don't care if they live here, as long as they do what we want them to do and they don't, speak up too much, right? I think that's how white Christian nationalists feel about immigrants of different faiths, right? Well, if they're here, fine, but they shouldn't have a voice in government, right? That's essentially what they're saying. And you can see it come down to things like building ordinances, right? Do you have a problem with your local government granting a building license to a local church? Okay. What about a local mosque, right? Or a local Hindu temple, right? And if you don't have a problem, if you do have a problem with the latter, then you have to find some justification for why that is the case. And then that's when you start pulling upon, tenuous strings of history, right? Well, historically we haven't done that, right? Those sorts of things, those weird justifications. I think that the same thing can be said with regards to, like, why are there so many churches that have American flags prominently placed at the front of the altar, right? Like, that's a very odd thing if you stop and think about it. There are even churches that say the Pledge of Allegiance on Sunday morning, or sing patriotic songs on the 4th of July, right?
Yeah.
If you were in China, right? Now, I know that China heavily restricts religious practice, but this is just a thought experiment for a moment. If you were in China in a church, and that church had prominently placed Chinese flags everywhere, right? And then they sang patriotic songs during the worship service, wouldn't you say, well, this is a very odd thing, right? Or, any other country, Canada, if they sang "Oh Canada" on Sunday morning, you would say this is a very peculiar thing to do, right? But in the United States, it's a very common practice. And to the point where it's transparent, right? A lot of the issue is that this stuff is so heavily inculcated in religious communities that it's just transparent. It doesn't seem odd to sing Battle Hymn of the Republic, right? It doesn't seem odd to sing, the Star Spangled Banner on Sunday morning, when I think it very much should be, right? Christianity is not an American religion in terms of its origin. It's a global religion, right? Christianity is the largest religion in human history. You can go anywhere just about anywhere in the world. And the Eucharist is celebrated on Sunday mornings across the globe. And I think that it would be peculiar in those regions to see such a strong connection to the nationalist sentiments of the particular country you find yourself in.
So we've got another question here. Maybe we can use this question to close ourselves out here. What do you see this current push towards theocracy ending or coming to a head? Where do you see this going? Let's use our future predicting skills. How do you think this is going to turn out in American politics and American culture?
I think the only sure way to know that will be in like next 50 days. I feel like I know everybody always says every election is like the most important election ever, but as far as like a bellwether, I'm very curious to see how this turns out. Given that it's a midterm, referendum on the president, which is, typically what they always say a midterm is. But it at the same time seems to be a 50-50 shot right now. I don't know. I don't know. It's hard to say. I don't know. I don't know if we thought things about Trump. I still firmly believe that Trump's just a con artist and he's just not competent, which is why nothing happened. If you had somebody smarter in place, things could have gotten a lot worse. I just can't say right now how it would come to an end. Worst case scenario, in my darkest, deepest thoughts, civil war or something like that, or mini militias cropping up, attacking.
Handmaid's Tale.
Yeah. Well, that's a little bit much. See, again, I don't know if they have. I don't think they have the organizational clout. I don't think they can do it. Not on that level. Like most modern civil wars are run by micro militia groups that crop up here and there, small underground organizations that terrorize people, but can't really take over in a sincere sense. So I don't know, but maybe not. Maybe I could be wrong. I don't know.
I think that part of the issue is the emphasis on something like theocracy. Is it a push which is being driven by a decline, right? So is this the death throes of the loss of cultural dominance, right? Or is this reascendancy? And that's the part that's hard to tell from the present, right? So is this a ratcheting up, or is it a death rattle? It's hard to say.
Yeah.
What I do think though is if we don't change from the present course, what I think is inevitable is that there will be more political violence because of the change in rhetoric, right? The rhetoric which is being tolerated is much more violent, and it's being coded in religious justification. And to the extent to which that continues, right, if we don't see a pulling back away from that sort of rhetoric, then I think that it's unfortunately inevitable that small groups, certainly, I don't think that you'll see mass waves of violence, but I do think that you will see, which if you go back and look, right, so frankly, we've talked for almost an hour and a half, but we really haven't covered that much historical ground. I mean, we haven't even talked about the birth of militia movements, Oklahoma City bombing, right? So the events at Waco, Ruby Ridge, right? These are all events where in recent history, we saw something very similar. It turned violent, and then you saw kind of a shying away, right? Pulling back. There was an intense reaction to a couple of years of violence where white supremacy, white Christian nationalism peaked, right? But the images at Ruby Ridge and Waco led to the violence at Oklahoma City. But when you saw children being pulled out of the federal building at Oklahoma, it put a lot of cold water on that movement, right? I mean, you had the FBI also targeting these neo-Nazi groups and these gun organizations much more heavily than they were in previous years, right? So there was a lot of tamping down in the background. But I think that just because we're leading up to something doesn't mean that we can't pull back from a precipice. Now, it may take something terrible for that to happen.
Yeah.
But
yeah, and
it's not inevitable.
I'll throw a more hopeful take since I was the one that brought up. And I'd just say to the people in chat, I can't respond. I'm sorry. I'd like to chat with you, but I don't think I have a comment block. So, but Dr. I dare you, I agree. But I was just going to say that what does bring hope is that in this year alone, there's been an 11% increase in women registrations to vote. I think that despite all of the machinations, this is why I say it's kind of a clusterfuck on the right side of things. Who tears down Roe v. Wade on a midterm year? Like just not even thinking about the ethical and moral ramifications of just as a political move. Like how stupid do you have to be to think that that's a great move? It's just like all you're going to do is inflame the people that you stand against you. And the uptick in women's registration is just absolutely astounding. And just across the board, I mean, by 5 years from now, there will be 2 women who graduate from college per every one male. So they will be the majority, college leaders in the country. 11% increase just so far, and that's coming in large part because the generational connections that are just so much stronger between older women and younger women because they're more sympathetic or something. I don't know. They connect better and men are just running around like a bunch of assholes with their head so far up their ego they can't figure things out. But I don't know. That gives me hope, and I do think young people are feeling like this current administration has actually given back to this some, especially with college debt, cuts. I think people will be happy with that. It's not as much as I think everybody wanted, but it is something. So, I think the numbers, especially with independents, it's still 2/3 don't want Trump. And I think they always say, as the president goes, so goes the country on a midterm year. And I think that as the representative of the Republican Party, who Trump still has a stranglehold on, goes, so does the midterm election. So I think that there's a really strong chance that progress will still be made in a direction that's more equitable for everybody. Slowly.
Well, apart from the immediate future, there's also, in the coming decades, we will cease to be a majority white, majority Christian country if we continue on present trajectories. And again, I just want to say, like, what does that mean? Is a lot of this reaction based on that sense of embattlement that that people that look like me, right, are not going to be able to dominate politics in the same way. I think that that concern, whether or not it's justified, is only going to get worse the closer we get to that being a reality. And so I think that the reactions will become more desperate, and who knows what the future holds. Hopefully better things.
Yeah, that's my biggest concern. What I'm concerned about is, and we have another friend of ours who studies radicalized groups named Cameron, who I'm trying to get on the YouTube channel. But I mean, you saw this recently with January 5th movement, and you're seeing it with groups like QAnon, who have absorbed a lot of Christian nationalist lingo and Christian nationalist belief. And what I'm worried is that we saw this kind of come out a lot when Trump was in office, especially white Christian nationalism is kind of what I'm talking about here. We saw hate attacks against minority groups, publicized, right? The Charleston, what happened in Charleston. Who were the Tiki Torch people, the Nazis that were out
The
there?
Proud
That was
Boys.
at Virginia. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that was the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville. And so there were representatives from a lot of different white
Right.
nationalists
But
and hate groups there.
I think the Proud Boys were the ones who like did the Tiki Torch thing. I think that was like their
Gotcha.
specific like calling card on that event.
Yeah. So I would like to say, like, yeah, maybe it's in its death throes, maybe it's on its way out. But I mean, you could easily imagine how January 5th could have gone like really south really quick. Like
Yeah.
that had the potential to be like some lives were lost. Yeah. But like, yeah, we have to remember like that was an attempted coup, right?
They came within 30 feet of
Yeah.
capturing the vice president of the United States, which is not nothing.
Right.
Yeah.
I think that the details only become more shocking the more they come out. Right, it becomes what you would think with a lot of details is like, oh, it looked bad on TV, but behind the scenes, things weren't as bad. No, they're much worse and could have been much worse.
Right.
It's a small miracle that it didn't, turn into something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So-
I don't think they're going. It's not going away. I think that the best case scenario, and we just don't know what'll happen. And the election will be very telling, and then the
Right.
months coming after that would be. I think that the Republican Party is at a trajectory of either becoming irrelevant or fracturing more likely than the Democrats, which everybody was concerned about when progressives really started digging into that party. So my guess is that they'll either dwindle while they're sort of recouping and figuring out what to do next, or there will be some dramatic breakdown. I think because you already had like a massive exodus of like the Matt Ryan like the Mitt Romney. I mean Mitt Romney and those guys they're all on their way out. Like that even if they were young, they don't have a future in that party.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess like what worries me about all of that is that this ideology, Ray, like you said, it's not going to go away anytime soon. And it's still going to carry with it the capability to radicalize young men.
Yeah.
Like that's going to be a real problem that's going to be with us for the rest of our lives, at least.
Yeah, that's a real like I don't think we need like an affirmative action thing for men, but that's a very concerning reality is all the like social statistics and studies that are being done on young men and the tendencies of isolation and the easiness with which a depressed young isolated man can accept misogynistic principles that they find on things like YouTube and shit like that. It's I don't know, just across the board I feel like we should talk more about trying to find a
Well, I think
role
that brings us
model.
full circle because I said that
something.
a lot of the appeal of what became white Christian nationalism, I think, has its origins in a disaffected masculinity, and that the appeal to a muscular Christianity is the appeal of traditionalism filtered through kind of a re-emphasis on traditional gender roles, on a traditional conception of masculinity. So it's rather than saying that in the modern world, right, maybe our conceptions of gender should change, rather than saying that, it's saying no, maybe everything else should change, right?
Yeah.
So
And I don't
rather
even
than adapt these conceptions, what really needs to change is everything just needs to go back to the way it was, right? And that idea, back to the way things were, this callback to traditionalism, and I know we're basically out of time, but this is the connection to palinogenic ultranationalism is fascism, right? this myth of a return, right? This fear of a decline of culture, which justifies this renewal of society, and which is at the same time a return to tradition. That runs through all of this, right? So we need to return to traditional gender roles, to traditional masculinity, to the times when white Christian male household leaders were the unquestioned authority, right? All of these appeals, which intersect all of these different cross sections of society, all terminate in fascism, right? Um, and so when we kind of pull the strings of the different elements of this, that's what the ultimate issue is. This disaffected sense of we're lost in the modern world, the old certainties are gone, and so do we build a bridge to the future, or do we try to reestablish that sense of certainty by retreating to the past? And in many cases, it's a mythological past that never existed in the first place.
Yeah, it doesn't even exist. And I would, and you can't. I don't think we should attempt to even redefine or recapture masculinity. It would definitely be, we just need to encourage more social interaction. I mean, every study that I've read in the last like year and a half, to just kind of following this with all of the social media platforms and the data that comes from it, a couple of people at Cornell who were doing interesting research on capturing that and analyzing it, and then some therapists in like the Northeast and like Brown University and stuff doing studies. They're just it always comes down to isolation.
Mm-hmm.
For whatever reason, technology, the way society structured itself as of late. COVID, of course, these are all coming after COVID, so that's happening. I mean, there was the study out of Brown that said that in a group of, is like a neighborhood, they were just kind of like doing some research on, especially with regards to children. The average kid only saw friends like twice a week, which is just like, holy shit, man! Like, we're social creatures. You need to get out there, otherwise weird things happen. I don't know.
Yeah.
So we don't even need to redefine masculinity. We just need to get people to come together, just like do shit together. There's a reason why urban elements, like urban areas, like cities, are more progressive and open. It's because there's exposure and interaction and just socialization. It's just a function of being close to human beings. And when you take that element and you distance everybody, then everybody becomes, there's just, yeah, touch
Well,
grass.
it's
Yes,
also getting,
exactly.
that's the thing, is you get caught in feedback loops too, right?
Yeah,
So,
exactly.
yeah, if you were
Algorithmic
isolated,
feedback loops.
yeah, if you're isolated from society, right, actual society, like maybe you go to work or you go to school, but you don't really have conversations with people, certainly not people that are different from you, and then you go and you spend, 4, 5, 6, 7 hours online in closed off spaces, which are algorithmically driven, right? And then you get funneled into, informational cul-de-sacs like the manosphere, right? Then what you're seeing is the proliferation and the reinforcement, which is again algorithmically driven, of toxic ideologies. Um, it's hard to say, especially if you don't have kind of what's the word I'm looking for? Critical thought, but
Self insight.
no, I mean, like, if you don't know how to navigate online critically,
Yeah.
then it's very easy to fall into these kind of avenues, these grooves, which we're expecting essentially children to find their way in a digital environment which is meant to exploit them. Is it any wonder that so many people are falling victim to bad ideologies? I mean, when ideologies themselves are being driven by engagement.
Yeah.
Um,
and Twitter and YouTube are being driven by what motivates people, which is fear and hate and toxicity. as opposed to happiness and joy and peace.
Right. On that enlightened note, thank you everyone in the chat for hanging out, for participating, having a conversation with us. Like I
Thanks
said
for having
before,
us.
yeah, this is something I'd like to start doing on a semi-regular basis. Jared and Raymond are friends of mine, so definitely gonna have them back. Jared, thank you for coming. Raymond, thank you for coming. And good night, everyone. See y'all later.